Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. It is the moment we have all been waiting for. It is time for the Overwatch League playoffs. They kick off this Sunday, and so today I have my bracket predictions for the playoffs. 12 teams are going in, but at the end of it, only one will be the champions. If you did not see my last video, I did a little primer where I talked about each of the teams, strengths, weaknesses, all that kind of stuff. So if you didn't see that, I'm going to link to that in the description and in the cards and at the end of this video. I'm not going to go super in-depth on every single team in this video because there's a lot of games to talk about, so I want to keep it rolling. So I'll kind of just give general thoughts on why I think certain teams will do better in the specific matchups, and then we'll kind of move on. I don't want to take too long on the bracket. So let's go. Let's dive in. These are my initial reactions. I haven't done a bracket yet, so we'll kind of talk through it. I have some ideas of where I think it's going to go, but not fully. So let's start with the first game on Sunday, which is the Philadelphia Fusion taking on the London Spitfire. That will be 5:30 p.m. Eastern on Sunday. This is an interesting game. It's the only game in the first round that is cross-regional, so between two teams from different regions. And I think it's a really interesting matchup. I think it's a really unique kind of different look for both of these teams that we kind of have. London really like to go with the kind of rush style. They play a lot more of that than any other team right now. They play a lot of Reinhardt, which other teams are not really playing a lot of right now. Whereas the Fusion have been really kind of in this weird spot recently where they've run a lot of Fury recently, which was kind of different from a lot of what they were doing earlier in the season, where they're playing mostly Belisria. It was kind of the Jotes meta, that Summer Showdown meta, where Fury kind of started to take the main starting role. It was a heavy D.Va and Zarya meta recently, though it does look like Winston is coming back into the hero pool quite heavily. Overall, I think in terms of just what playstyle it is, I find it really tough to pick London in a lot of these matchups when we don't really know what the meta is going to be, but they seemingly know what they like to run. They're comfortable in those Reinhardt compositions, so that does work in their favor, that they're probably going to run something that they're comfortable with. They don't really care what the meta looks like necessarily. I'm not a huge believer in Kiriko right now. I don't think she's going to be meta, but she could be. It's possible. Definitely not something I'm going to write off, but I like the Fusion a lot. I like what they've done quite a bit. The Spitfire have been good as well, but right now I just feel better about the Fusion. I think they've looked better in tournaments. I think they reached their peak in tournaments. They haven't played on LAN yet, which is a little bit concerning, but I think it'll be a close series that I'm going to say goes 3-2 in favor of the Fusion. Close one, not completely one-sided, but I think the Fusion take this one based on what I've seen from them so far. Next is the Hangzhou Spark taking on the Shanghai Dragons. This is an interesting matchup because the Spark obviously been struggling recently, but with the meta potentially moving towards more Winston, we might see a lot of Gushui Winston, which is what they ran in their win over the Chengdu Hunters. Looked very good for them in that matchup. And I think it's a really interesting match, mainly because I really like the Spark recently. I think when Pineapple came in, they looked really, really good. Despite the fact that ATVI has been really solid all season, I think Pineapple has just brought another level to this team. They feel like they've figured out who they are. Shanghai, looking a little weak recently. And I think this will be a close one. They played very close last time they played. Shanghai reverse swept Hangzhou Spark last time they met. I could see it being close again. I don't know what the meta is going to bring, but to me, there's something about Shanghai where I have a lot of faith in them getting into the playoffs and knowing that this is the match that matters most. I think they know exactly who they are. They know what they want to do. And so I think it'll be close again, and I could see the Spark upsetting like they did over the Dynasty in the Midseason Madness, but I feel better about the Dragons right now. I think it'll be close, but I'm going to give it to the Dragons because I right now just think they have looked better as a whole, and so I'm going to give them the edge in that one. Up next is the Florida Mayhem versus the Atlanta Reign. This is a really interesting matchup because these two teams have been kind of up and down all season. I believe they've split games this season. I could be wrong. Atlanta may have won both other matchups, but I believe they've split games. And so these are two teams that are kind of in interesting spots. Neither one of them feels, to me at least, particularly clearly a favorite. Both teams have looked pretty good. I think Atlanta has the better roster and the better highs. So they have the better potential. I think they've looked better as a whole this season, especially in tournament plays. You look back at what they did in the Kickoff Clash where they got third, and the Midseason Madness where they got third. really good run in Midseason Madness against a lot of the APAC region teams. So I like what Atlanta's done so far. I think that they've looked pretty good. They've looked better against the East than they have against the West in a lot of cases, but it's a tough one to call because I think the Mayhem are playing well right now as well. I do think the Mayhem are a bit slow to adapt to metas. They seemingly get better as the tournaments and the stages progress. Atlanta, to a degree, has that problem, though I don't think it's as major as it is with Florida. So I think this one's also close. And these are really good first-round matches, I think, just in terms of like the actual matchups themselves. You know, there may be teams that are obviously better than others, but I think a lot of them are matching up against teams that it's hard to predict either way. I'm going to give the edge in this one to the Atlanta Reign. I think they have just looked better as of late, and I think that they just seem to be the stronger overall team going into a tournament setting where I think they are going to put in their all. They have such talented pieces across the roster. I think we finally start to really see them click this weekend and in this first match against the Mayhem. And then the final match in the first round is the Toronto Defiant versus the Houston Outlaws. Last time these two teams played, it was a victory for the Defiant in the Countdown Cup qualifiers, and they beat them in the Summer Showdown. The Summer Showdown one, I think, was a more of an indictment on the Outlaws. I don't think the Countdown Cup matchup was necessarily one that the Outlaws cared as much about because it already locked up their spot for the playoffs, so I think they were probably scrimming on the new patch. Something that we've also seen for teams like Atlanta versus the Mayhem, right? Atlanta's had more time to scrim on this patch, as of the Outlaws versus the Defiant, Dragons versus the Spark. Those are things that the benefit of that matchup kind of goes towards the Outlaws. The Outlaws have had time to scrim the new patch, the new meta, and they've been definitely focused more on that than I think the Defiant have. So I think the edge in this one is to the Outlaws. The Outlaws have, generally speaking, looked better than the Defiant this season. I think the overall record is actually either 2-2 or 3-2 in favor of the Defiant. The Defiant won both regular season matchups plus their most recent one. They won both regular season matchups and the matchup in the Summer Showdown, while the Outlaws won the Kickoff Clash and Midseason Madness matchups. I think the Outlaws are a little bit better, though, so I think it'll be close. I'm going to be at 3-2, but I'm going to go with the Outlaws for that one. I think they just look somewhat better right now. Which means now we get to the selection part of the bracket. The 1 seed is the Dallas Fuel, so they will have first selection between the Fusion, the Dragons, the Reign, and the Outlaws. And I think that's a tough group to really pick from, because I think you have to kind of consider what all these teams have done so far. When I view Dallas, I think the Dallas Fuel know what they are and know where they kind of have their strengths and their weaknesses. They lost to the Fusion when they played them in the Midseason Madness. They got destroyed by the Fusion, kind of hit scan and whatnot, which is in the Fuel's biggest problem. I don't think they would pick the Outlaws. I don't think they pick the Dragons. Those teams are too good. They also the Dragons and the Fusion, actually, in the Midseason Madness. Those are your top two teams. I don't think you choose either of them. The Fuel have not looked good against the Outlaws this season. I think they're too good to pick them, and the Dragons are a really good team. I don't think you want to face them either. So you're picking between the Fusion and the Reign at that point. I think it's a tough call because at least with the Reign, who I think are probably right now the better team than the Fusion. It's close, but they're probably the better team right now than the Fusion are. If you're the Fuel, I don't know why that came out through. If you're the Fuel, the Fusion are an unknown quantity. You played them once this season, it didn't go well. The Reign, on the other hand, you've played multiple times. You've played them throughout the season. You've played them, multiple times this season, at least 3, maybe even 4 times throughout the season. I think it's been 3, though. And I think that is a much better and more attainable goal if you're the Fuel, is trying to beat the Atlanta Reign. Because you've done it before, you know what they are, you know who they are as a team. The Fusion are a bit more of an unknown quantity. They struggled against them the last time they played. Things have changed, obviously, and all that could come down to how the Fusion look. But I think if you're the Fuel, you pick the Atlanta Reign because you know them more, you've seen them more, you're more used to their play style. I think that's the safer pick. If I'm the Shock, then I'm picking the Fusion because the Fusion are the weakest of the 3 teams remaining at that point in time. I would much rather play them than any other team. It just is the one that I think makes the most sense logically. if you're the Shock at that point in time. Gladiators, I think, take the Outlaws. They've had relative success against the Outlaws this season. I don't think they've lost to the Outlaws yet this season. I'm trying to remember who they lost to in the... I guess they did lose to the Outlaws in the Summer Showdown, but I think they would pick the Outlaws. I don't think you pick the Dragons at all, which leaves the Dynasty with the Shanghai Dragons. So there you go. Those are the matchups that I think we get. It's honestly a shot in the dark. Who knows what we're going to get matchups-wise, but that's just my guess based on kind of what we've seen so far. So Dallas Fuel, Atlanta Reign. I think that you have to view the Fuel right now as the better team, as the team that's favored. They are the global #1 seed. I don't know how good this meta is going to be for them, but I think they look better right now than the Reign have. And so to me, the Fuel should be the favorites in this matchup, and I'm going to give them the edge here. I'll say a 3-1 for them. Hitscan matchup is definitely the thing I'm most concerned about, but if it's Sojourn that we see a lot of, which it seems possible that it is, I think the Fuel are fine. Edison is a very good Sojourn. Kai's a good Sojourn as well, don't get me wrong, but Edison Sojourn looks pretty good. And then, depending on what the other DPS pick is, if it's Sombra, if it's Genji, who knows what it's going to be. I think the Fuel overall kind of thrive more in that role than the Reign do. And I think if it's, depending on what the tank is, I think the Fuel just look better. They look better on Winston, and they look better on D.Va and Zarya. So I think the Fuel look right now to be a better team based on where I think the meta is going. They've looked better recently than the Reign have. And so I think that the Fuel have the edge in that one. Seoul Dynasty versus the Shanghai Dragons. They've had, bangers all season. Really, really good matches from them. But the last time they played was not particularly close. The Dragons don't look great right now, and the Dynasty do look really, really good. Obviously, both teams have had more time to scrim and travel and whatnot than other teams in the APAC region, so it's a little more difficult to kind of place where they are. But I feel really good with the Dynasty right now. I think Smurf has shown an ability to play all three of the main tank picks right now, Winston, Zarya, and D.Va, so I think in that regard, you don't have to worry about tank synergy or tank flexibility. You can play whatever you need, whatever point, and you know how to play Sigma. So those are kind of the four main tank picks I would expect. Because Circuit Royale is in the map pool for the playoffs, so there's always a possibility of to play the Sigma, which is something that I don't really have a fear about with the Dynasty. I think that since Iris joined the team, I think their backline just has a little bit more lethality and looks a little bit better than it did prior, and I think that we've seen such great performances out of Profit and Fitz and even Stalker this year. So I'm going to give the edge to the Dynasty. I think they look better right now. I think it's close. It's been close pretty much every time they've matched up this season, but right now I feel better about the Dynasty, so I'm going to give them the edge here over the Dragons. Shock against the Fusion. I like the Fusion a lot. They're one of my Dark Horse teams. I don't think they're going to beat the Shock, though. I think the Shock are a little too good right now. I think with the rest they'll probably get, it'll be a good look from them. Proper, as long as he's not dealing with the injury he was dealing with, which I think he's fine now. I don't see the Shock really running into many issues. I think they're going to be a fine team. Fusion, I think, have potential, but I think this is not a great matchup for them against the Shock. I just think the Shock are too good of a team for the Fusion to find success. Fusion might even play the Fuel. Who knows? I think it's one of those teams is going to play the other. It's just kind of the way things work. But I like what the Fusion have done, and so I think that it's going to be interesting to see them here, but I think the Shock are the better overall team. And then the final match here is the Gladiators versus the Outlaws. I really like what the Gladiators have done this season. I think that their tournament performances are unbelievably good. They look incredibly dominant in tournament situations. So to me, the edge is to the Gladiators in this one. I like the Outlaws. I think they've been pretty good so far this season, but I don't feel like they are in a better position than the Gladiators right now. And so I'm going to give the edge to the Gladiators. So that's our first two rounds in the upper bracket, which would set up a Dallas Fuel versus Seoul Dynasty matchup here and a San Francisco Shock versus LA Gladiators matchup down here. But of course, we have to go down to the lower bracket now. We've gone through Sunday and Monday, so now Tuesday, we get to the lower bracket matchups. And the first one would be the London Spitfire taking on the Houston Outlaws. And this is an interesting matchup. These two teams are both in kind of weird positions where I don't love either of them right now. The Outlaws, I think, have been the team with the higher peak. I don't think their tournament performances have been particularly impressive, though I do think that they are a overall pretty solid team that has looked good throughout the majority of the season. The London Spitfire, to me, are a more interesting team in the fact that they have the ability to find success in a look that is not necessarily what you would expect, they said, with the Reinhardt competitions before. So the Spitfire are an interesting team to track. And I feel weird, like, one of these teams, or London either goes 0-2 in my eyes, or Houston goes 1-2 and bounces out, like, pretty early. That's the nature of the playoffs. It's really tough to kind of predict that type of stuff. I don't love either of these teams right now, but I just feel better about Houston than I do London. Saying London's going to go 0-2 doesn't feel right because they always win a playoff game, and I think they 100% the game against Fusion could go either way. I just feel better about the Fusion right now. I especially feel like the Fusion have more have shown more of an ability to go do well and go deep in playoffs. I think Houston is not a great matchup for London, mainly because I just think Houston has the edge in the DPS line, and I think that Houston has just looked better as a team this season. London is good. I think they have limitations. I think that we've seen those limitations. Both of these teams have limitations, but right now I just feel better about Houston. I think it's a close one, but I think it goes the way of the Outlaws. London Spitfire in this bracket are the first team out of the playoffs, which brings us to our next matchup, the Philadelphia Fusion versus the Hangzhou Spark. Now, they played twice in the Midseason Madness. They played the first round where the Spark 3-0 dominated the Fusion. Maybe it was 3-1, but they beat them. Then they played again later in the bracket, and the Fusion were victorious in that matchup. Since then, both these teams have had different trajectories. The Spark, not a very good second half of the season. Fusion, not a great second half, but a better second half, and of course a top 3 finish in the Eastern region. I think the Fusion right now look better. I think they've looked better as the season has progressed. The Spark had their moments in the play-in tournament, but that doesn't change the fact that they were a 2-10 team in the second half of the year. It feels very difficult for me to see them doing well in this tournament, despite the fact that Shai has played very well, despite the fact that I think the tank duo of Bernard and Gouchue covers basically everything you need from them. And I think with map picks, teams typically do better than they would normally. I just like the Fusion more. I think they've had more, they've had a higher ceiling so far this season. And I think they take this one by a score of 3-1, knocking the Spark out of the playoffs. As much as I like the Spark, at times, they just have not impressed me late in the season. And I think that the idea that they will do well in the playoffs feels kind of unlikely. Moving on, Shanghai Dragons versus the Florida Mayhem. I mean, I think this one's pretty obvious. I haven't been a big Mayhem fan so far this season. I think the Dragons are the better team. To me, the Dragons just have way more lethality as a team. They have a much higher ceiling than the Mayhem do. And even I think the Dragons' floor is higher, or at least equivalent to where the Mayhem's average performance is. You know, we've seen the Dragons be pretty bad, but I don't think they're ever terrible. And I think it's tough to judge because I think generally speaking, the APAC region was a lot closer. It was very rare for a team. I think the only team that went 6-0 in a qualifiers in the APAC region was the Shanghai Dragons in the Summer Showdown, where they just looked dominant. So the APAC region was a tough region. It was hard to do. It was hard to go undefeated in a qualifier. And so to me, the top of the APAC region, or the average APAC region performances, those teams are better than your average Western region teams. So I think the Dragons win this one. I don't think it's particularly competitive. I'll give the Mayhem a map because I think they have some decent players, and I think with map pick, you should be able to at least win a map. But I just think the Dragons have the stars, they have the name recognition, they've been around for a while, they've, you know, big tournament experience. Florida's a lot of rookies, a lot of young guys, a lot of people who don't have a ton of big game experience. So to me, that just bodes well for the Dragons in this one. Next, Toronto Defiant versus the Atlanta Reign. I like the Reign a lot. I think they've looked really good so far this season. When they're playing their best, they look really good. The problem is they don't always play their best. They're a pretty inconsistent team. But generally speaking, I think that they should be able to beat the Defiant. The Defiant, to me, have been very middling. They have not looked very good in the recent tournament in the Countdown Cup. They were okay. They were fine. But to me, the Reign have just been the better team so far this season. It could go either way, definitely, depending on what the meta is. The Defiant have a path to victory with, some of their best players, on the team with Hisu and Twilight and Chorong especially. Like, those three players are such high-level talents that they could definitely be a team that is threatening and dangerous and manages to get a nice win over the Reign, but I just don't see it. I'll say Reign 3-1 victory there over the Toronto Defiant. That brings us to the next round here in elimination games before we move up to the upper bracket again. Houston Outlaws versus the Philadelphia Fusion. Ooh, this is a spicy game. This is an interesting one. I don't know. I might have an unpopular opinion here, but I think the Fusion right now look better than the Outlaws do. The Outlaws, to me, just have a little bit too much of a problem with their overall flexibility and the way they play. I don't think their peaks are nearly as high as what the Fusion are able to do. The Fusion have impressed me many, many times throughout the season. They've played above themselves a lot. The Outlaws have done it against the Fuel. They haven't really done it much against other teams. They have had wins, of course, against the Shock and the Gladiators, but those teams weren't playing well in those moments. And obviously those are big wins, right? I don't want to take away and say that those wins aren't good. But they don't have the same context as a lot of the Fusion big wins, right? Fusion took the Dynasty pretty far in the most recent match without Zest, who's been one of their best players all year. They had that big win against the Seoul Dynasty at the end of the Mid-Season Madness qualifiers. They did really well in the Mid-Season Madness tournament and in the Kickoff Clash tournament. The Fusion have had much bigger moments to me this season that have been more impressive than what the Outlaws have had. Now, maybe the Outlaws are the better team overall, but like I said before with that Dragons Mayhem game, generally speaking, I think that what we've seen in reality is more that the APAC teams are just the top 3 APAC teams are just below the kind of peak of the Western region, but they're better, generally speaking, than the majority of the Western region teams. And so I think the Fusion take this one. I think they've been better. I think it's close. I'll say a 3-2. I think that both of these teams are good and respectable teams. But I think the APAC region just looks better right now. I think the Fusion have looked a little bit better than the Outlaws have, and so I'm going to give this one to the Fusion. 3-2 over the Outlaws. Shanghai Dragons versus Atlanta Reign. This is a really tough one to call, because last time they played, the Reign were victorious in the Mid-Season Madness. The Reign had a really good run in that tournament. And so it's hard for me to look back on that match and ignore that match, especially when the Dragons haven't been playing particularly great recently. I think the Reign are better than the Mayhem. I think the Dragons will be somewhat confidently able to beat the Mayhem. The Reign, to me, are a much better playoff team than the Mayhem have been. And I think when you look back at their last matchup, it was a pretty one-sided affair for the Reign. The Reign have just looked better as a whole in their most recent matchup. Now, you go back to the 2021 Grand Finals, it wasn't close at all. The Dragons dominated in that one. But in the Reign have just been able to kind of play a lot more of what makes them kind of good. And we're not coming off a stage where the Dragons looked invincible. They looked pretty weak and pretty beatable. And I think that there's a really valid argument to be made that the Dragons are the better team in this matchup. And they come in here and they dominate the Reign. 100% possible. We haven't seen these teams play each other on LAN in 3 years. They've played in international tournaments, of course, playing on like the Ping with Project Aloha. But this is the first time we're going to see both of these teams playing on LAN against each other in a long time. So I think that's really exciting as well. So this will be a really fun one to watch, and I think it's going to be a good one. But I'm going to give it to the Reign because I just think both teams are coming off somewhat middling qualifiers in the Countdown Cup. But where I think the edge goes to the Reign is that their roster looks better than the last time they've played. Now, depending on what the meta is, the Dragons could have a much higher ceiling. But I think the Reign right now are coming off a better look to their roster. It wasn't particularly, close last time they played. It was like, I didn't watch that game as closely as all the other games I have, so It's hard for me to kind of fully remember what happened in them, but the Reign were really, really good in the Midseason Madness. They had a really good run. They were particularly good against the APAC region. And so to me, they feel like a team that should be able to come back again with good results against teams from the APAC region. And I think they take a win there over the Dragons. Back up to the winners bracket, still on on Wednesday, November 2nd. Dallas Fuel versus Seoul Dynasty. This is a really interesting matchup. Obviously, in Midseason Madness, we did not see the Dallas Fuel make it super far. They went 0-2 and got out very early on. I think they're better now than they were then. I think the meta favors them a little bit better, so I think they have a much higher chance of having a good performance in this tournament than they did in the Midseason Madness. I think Hanbin's playing particularly well. Their seeding is better this time around than it was before, so I think they have that going in their favor. They have more control over who they play. I think they just look better as a team. Seoul, interesting team who I think have a really high ceiling and are coming off a really solid qualifier. 5-1, much like the Dallas Fuel. They're also 5-1. So I think both teams are coming off pretty nice runs, and I think this match should be pretty close. And I think a lot of it's going to come down to the tank matchup between what I suspect will be Smurf versus Hanbin the majority of the time. We could see Fearless. If we do see Fearless, then it's a Winston duel between literally like the two best Winstons in the Overwatch League, which absolutely incredible. And it's going to come down to that DPS duel. And I just think in most of those roles, the Seoul Dynasty have looked better this season. With the exception of Hanbin's peaks, I think arguably being the best of any tank in the league. Smurf has been right up there as well. But I've loved Prophet this year. I think that the Seoul Dynasty have a much more firm and solidified identity. They don't make a lot of changes. We're either going to see Prophet and Fitz or Prophet and Stalker for probably the entire tournament. And there won't be much changing up. Their support line is what it is. It's not going to change. I love the Dynasty. I think the Dynasty look really, really good right now. I think they've been one of the best teams in the world. And I think they are going to take this one. I think it's going to be close. I think it's going to be a banger between some of those legends of Element Mystic and some of those legends that make up that Seoul Dynasty roster when you consider, you know, Prophet and his history on, I believe it was GC Busan, right? And Smurf with the, you know, his history with the San Francisco Shock. I love the Dynasty right now. I think the Dynasty look great, and I think they're going to take this one. I think it's going to be a close one. I think it's probably the best game of the tournament up until this point in my eyes. But to me, banger of a matchup that goes the way of the Dynasty. Shock versus Gladiators. I think the Gladiators right now are in probably the best position to win. They won both of the previous tournaments that they were in. They won the last global tournament. They're coming off a 6-0 qualifier in the Countdown Cup. The Shock are not coming off their best performances. I'm sure some of it was them trying to get themselves in a better position for the playoffs. But right now, I think the Shock did not look great in their first 3 matchups in the Countdown Cup. And I think that, to me, is a really, really, really scary sign to look at when I look at the Shock as a roster. Whereas the Gladiators, to me, are coming off of a really nice qualifier. They don't have to travel. The Shock don't have to travel really either, but I think both these teams are based in LA at the moment. To me, the Gladiators right now have the momentum. I think things are in the driver's seat for them. They've just looked so much better in tournaments than any other team this season. It's hard to pick against them. I'm going to say 3-1 for the Gladiators over the Shock. I really like what the Gladiators have done so far. I think they've looked incredible this year. I think they've looked like one of the best teams all season consistently. So to me, I have to go in favor of the Gladiators over the Shock. Not that the Shock have looked bad by any means. The Gladiators just look that good. All right, let's see. What is our next matchup? On Thursday. All right, here we go. So, lovely. All right. Next is Dallas Fuel versus Philadelphia Fusion. A nice little rematch. I believe I didn't put them before, right? I had the Fusion in the rain, or the Fuel in the rain, right? Yeah. So this will be a rematch from their last matchup in the Midseason Madness, which is cool. I think a lot of this is always going to come down to the meta. Fury, if he gets to play, I think the Fusion, generally speaking, look better when Fury plays. His Zarya's look really, really good. His Diva's really, really good, of course. Winston is going to be Bellisria versus Fearless in that case, if that's what the meta is. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's going in that direction. I think that those are all valid options, especially on maps. Map-dependent pool. The hit skin argument is really, to me, what it comes down to. I think that the hit scan, MN3 is better. I don't think MN3 has been as consistent this season as what I would like from like the star hit scan player in this matchup, but he's been really, really good. So overall, I think it's a pretty solid matchup. I think the Fuel are the better team. I think the meta works better for them. I think Edison on Sojourn is a good enough pick, and a like pretty good pick at that he has the means to just kind of carry his weight as he needs to, which he wasn't able to do as much in Mid-Season Madness between him and Guerrillo. They've solidified their team a lot more since then. They've kind of figured out their strengths and weaknesses. I think they're a better team now than they were back then. And so to me, the Fusion should struggle a bit more against the Fuel this time than they did in the Mid-Season Madness. I hate this matchup because I keep wanting to say Fuel for Fusion and Fusion for Fuel. I'm going to move on from this one. Fuel, I think, take this one. I'm going to say 3-1 victory for them. Potentially the end of the great careers of Carpe and Fury here, but I think the Fuel take this one. The Fusion, once again, their season ends in sadness and pain. Next, Shock versus Rain. Last time these two teams played, it was a reverse sweep for the Shock against the Rain. So this is an interesting one because I don't think either of these teams looked particularly incredible in the Countdown Cup qualifiers. The Shock had a much better second half, of course. They went 3-3, losing their first 3, winning their second 3. Atlanta Rain definitely have more work to do, I think, to improve their team. But they don't have as much time, of course, anymore. I like what both of these teams have shown so far this season and what they've shown as of late. I think the Rain have been better overall in tournaments than the Shock have. The Shock did get second place in the Mid-Season Madness and in the Summer Showdown. The Rain looked better in the Mid-Season Madness than they did in the Kickoff Clash, but they still did well in the Kickoff Clash. The real issue is that they didn't make the Summer Showdown. So this is an interesting matchup to me. I think it's probably going to go the way of the Shock. I think they've looked better the majority of the season. We haven't seen them come out big in those big tournament moments, but their past 2 tournaments have been very good from them, getting second place both times. So I think they probably are the favorites in this matchup, and I think they'll probably end up taking this one. But I think it's going to be close. I think it's another 3-2 between these two teams, but I think the Shock ultimately will be the team to take this one away. Moving on to the upper bracket finals, I have Seoul Dynasty versus LA Gladiators. Pretty sure this is my upper bracket finals for the Mid-Season Madness as well. Oh, I can't talk. And I think that the Gladiators right now are the better team. I think they look better. I think they look like arguably the best team in the league right now. As much as I love the Dynasty, I got to give it to the Gladiators. I'll say a 3-2. I think it'll be close, but to me, Gladiators right now look like arguably the best team in the world, and so I'm going to give them the edge there. That sets up a lower bracket matchup between the Fuel and the Shock. The Fuel have been really good against the Shock recently, so I'm going to give the edge to the Fuel here. I'm going to say 3-1. I just think the Fuel, their past 2 matchups with the Shock just have not been close. Past 3 matchups with the Shock have not been close. And that was in the Summer Showdown. It's a different meta, but I think the Fuel are coming off a really good qualifier. And so for me, I just feel like it's going to be one that goes in favor of the Dallas Fuel. So this sets up for the lower bracket finals, Dallas Fuel versus the Seoul Dynasty. A rematch of a match we've already had before, which isn't that surprising at this point in the tournament. Another banger, I suspect. I think it's going to be a split, close 3-2 series no matter what. I gave the edge to the Dynasty the last time up here. I'm going to give them the edge again. I think they're the better team right now, which sets up a grand finals between the Gladiators and the Dynasty, of which I think will go in favor of the Gladiators once again. I'll say a 4-2. I like the Dynasty a lot. I think they're a very good team, but I just right now think the Gladiators are the best-looking team in the world, and so I think they have the edge there. So there you go. That's my whole bracket. We'll run through it real quick. I'll just kind of go slowly through all of my picks so you can see them all, and you can get all of your favorite little comments ready about my bracket if you agree with it, disagree with it, whatever. It is what it is. Things be that way sometimes. I'm excited for this playoffs. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. It's going to be really fun. I think the closest one we're going to have so far in Overwatch League history. So I'm really, really excited for it. I think it's going to be a great tournament. And I'm so excited for LAN again for a big tournament. It's been so long since we've had one of those, so I'm ready for that to go. So that's all for my picks here. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on my bracket, if you agree with it, if you disagree with it, who you think is going to win the grand finals. Let me know in the comments down below. That is all for me for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Check back next week where I will have my awards for the season. So my Roll Stars, my MVP, Rookie of the Year, Coach of the Year, all those awards, I'll be giving those out next week. So stay tuned for that next week. And enjoy the playoffs, of course. But that is going to be all from me for today. Thank you all once again. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.